It's closed captioning. That is a feature that you can follow along with on our YouTube channel, and today's discussion will be transcribed and available in a few days. Thank you so much for joining us today and listening in on our conversation with Dean Spade about the inclusion of queer and trans people in the U.S. military. We will discuss the reasons for why queer and trans inclusion became a more mainstream objective. How is this inclusion in Empire being framed? What the pitfalls of that framing are, and why we all should be concerned with the inclusion of queer and trans folks in the military, and how to hold that within our analysis of U.S. Empire. First, a bit about me. My name is Shiloh Emelein. I joined the Marine Corps at the ripe age of 20, though I was repeatedly told by my recruiter that I would not be deployed. Roughly 6 months after boot camp, I was deployed to Al Anbar province in Iraq in 2006 and then to Kuwait City. The entirety of my contract in the Marines was under the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy that required LGBTQ military members to live in the shadows for fear of reprisal. And at the time, I was certainly not asking and certainly not telling anyone or even myself my truth about being queer or trans. On April 24th, 2011, which was arguably the best day of my life thus far, I was discharged and released from the military. Later that year, under the Obama administration, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy was dropped, and LGBTQ military members could ostensibly be open about their identities. As the newly released queer that I was, I just so happened to be in the Castro district in San Francisco at the time, where much jubilation filled the streets and bars. And I'll admit, it was hard not to get swept away in the feelings of celebration. though I felt in my heart and in my gut that something was very off about now celebrating the right for people to be able to join the brutal and violent organization that had warped my sense of self and my worldview. That I couldn't name it at the time, a furthering of disillusionment and resistance was growing in me that day. Fast forward to July of 2017, when the president, who shall not be named, announced the ban on trans folks in the military via Twitter. I was elated. My community would once again no longer be able to serve in the empire. Reason to celebrate, right? But it appeared that I was a party of one. Like wildfire, the mainstream LGBT movement that is most often more concerned with accessing state and straight power than supporting the actual everyday needs of queer and trans folks rushed in and exalted discrimination. How could he just take away our right to serve? All the while completely ignoring the very real point of the US military, which is exploitation and extermination of peoples in order to extract the resources and line the pockets of the defense industry. These supposed leaders of the LGBT movement, clutching their rainbow-striped American flags, claim to be fighting for human rights while woefully or willfully ignoring the humanity and rights of the people of Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Yemen, Libya, Syria, and frankly, the world over, and all the while ignoring the impact, trauma, and incumbent moral injury that the individual queer trans person they claim to support would endure through their service. Nevertheless, the wildfire that is the mainstream LGBT movement fought on, pouring millions of dollars in priceless energy into retaining their access to join the military, all the while ignoring the very real reasons that so many queer and trans folks join the military. They poured millions of dollars into their crusade while the poverty draft that preys on the working class and marginalized communities waged on. Can you imagine what could be done with that money and energy to further the lives of queer and trans siblings who struggle every day to access life-affirming and life-saving healthcare, who are displaced from their families of origin, who struggle to access higher education, who face exponentially higher rates of incarceration and police violence, and that only increases for our BIPOC siblings? Can you imagine what reprioritizing our efforts away from the military-industrial complex could do? I dare you to, and I need you to imagine this world with us. In 2020, once again, the guise of progress in the so-called United States was elected to the presidency. Within his first 5 days of taking office, President Biden signed an executive order repealing the ban on trans military participation. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, former general and former Raytheon board member, was paraded around lauding the move and stating that anyone who is fit and can maintain standards should be allowed to serve in the military, and that he would support and protect their rights to be in the ranks. In other words, we saw a fire lit under politicians to expeditiously support and protect trans individuals like we have never seen before and never seen since. 5 days is all it took to make sure trans folks could be implicated in the violence of U.S. empire and continue lining the pockets of the defense industry. And here we are, hundreds of years later, and indigenous lands on Turtle Island are still being poisoned by the U.S. military. Trans women of color are routinely and disproportionately subjected to the police state, and the U.S. is still installing anti-queer and anti-trans dictators around the world, and so on and so forth. Today's discussion stems from the bubbling frustration of the mainstream media and narrative that wants us to believe that queer and trans inclusion in the military is progress and a means for celebration, meanwhile never engaging in meaningful critique of the U.S. imperialism. It has been a wild imagination of mine to be in conversation with our guest, Dean Spade, for many years, and I'm beyond elated to welcome him here on About Face's DemilitarizeU. Dean has been working in movements for queer and trans liberation and racial economic justice for the past 2 decades. He's the author of Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of Law, and the director of the documentary Pinkwashing Exposed, Seattle Fights Back. His latest book, Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next, was published in 2020, and I can't recommend it enough. Dean Spade, welcome to DemilitarizeU.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this work. I'm so excited to be part of this conversation and to do anything with About Face, of which I am a fan.
Thank you, Dean. I'm wondering if you could share with us how you came to anti-militarism or organizing and work, and what lineages and movements are you bringing into your work of dismantling militarism?
I was thinking about this, and I think my first anti-war protest was a walkout when I was in middle school during the Persian Gulf War in the early 90s. And I think part of why that's interesting for me to think about is like, why did I think I was anti-war? Like, I'm like this rural kid living in Central Virginia, not being exposed to left ideas mostly. There's no internet. It's just like, there's like maybe a TV station and a couple radio stations. Like, how did I know I was anti-war? And I think that like the significance of how delegitimized war was by the anti-Vietnam War movement is so profound now, because there's been so much done since then to re-legitimize the military and war. And so I just like noticed that difference, that there was some kind of like, even though to me it seemed like the 60s and 70s had been a million years ago, when it's like the early 90s and I'm a middle schooler, I knew this thing that war was bad, and I lived in a soup that included the delegitimization of war. And I just think that's fascinating to think about how that has shifted in our lifetimes. So I think that like I had like a just general sense that war was bad and the military is bad, that I got from kind of almost like mainstream culture, I think, interestingly. Even though I lived in a conservative area, and of course, tons of people I know, their parents were Vietnam vets. My dad was a Korean War vet. But anyway, I think that so that was just kind of like no question. And then as I came into high school, I started to have some feminist awakenings just of my own that were mostly had a hard time finding like materials about it or like anywhere to learn about it. And then finally like left home at like 16 and found queer people and feminism. And I think pretty quickly in my life, partly because I was somebody from a working class background and experienced different kinds of alienation about what was coming to the surface as like sort of mainstream gay politics in the 90s, I found other queer and trans working class people. And I eventually moved to New York City in the mid 90s, and Giuliani was mayor. And I like became part of movements that were like opposing the attacks on people on welfare that were happening like in the mid 90s, and the attacks on immigrants happening with the federal level in the mid 90s. And also like in Giuliani's New York City, the kind of like generalized like attacks on queer space, increased criminalization of sex workers and street vendors and homeless people and people with psychiatric disabilities. And that whole lefty queer politics is and was anti-war. And so I think like that meant that every single time there was another escalation of US militarism, just as we were going to be out in the streets, protesting about needle exchange or about AIDS housing, we were also going to be out about, of course, like the war in Iraq being like the really big moment in that period around 2003. And I think so for me, like my queer politics has always been inseparable from an anti-war, anti-militarism politics, or like also living in New York City where there's like a huge, Puerto Rican population. People are always talking about Vieques at the time, and like the, Navy dropping bombs on Vieques. Like just like all of these pieces around sites of US military violence were just things I was always learning about from other people in the queer and trans liberation struggle who I was fighting side by side with. But we were also always responding, as you were just saying, to the fact that there was the most well-funded gay and lesbian organizations in my lifetime, especially at sort of 90s on, became very invested in especially gay and lesbian military inclusion and eventually trans military inclusion. And so we were like also having this battle all the time, right? About what is queer liberation? Is it something where we get to be cops and where we get to be soldiers, or is it something where there are no more cops and no more soldiers? And I think that, has very much shaped how I've thought about my queer politics, because it's been like kind of in opposition to that, that story, that national story that's been unfolding the whole time I've been, queer adult.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I was wondering if you could maybe walk us through a bit of like how did the queer and trans inclusion in the military become mainstream? Like who was behind that push?
Okay, I'm not going to do like the fully detailed political history that deserves, but I think something that's been really significant to me is to notice that what we're told are like the issues of a community are not necessarily because the people in that community have identified it as our like key survival issue, right? That's really essential. So it's like the way that marriage, the military, the idea of gay cops or hate crime laws, like the way those things become like what we're told are going to bring liberation to gay people or trans people is so much because that's mediated through like a corporate media that always wants to tell a story that is about like if it's going to take somebody from a hated group and say no, people in this group are actually okay, it's going to do that through like a imperialist, racist, classist, sexist lens. So it's going to be like, look, there are white gay and lesbian immigrants who just want to get married and have children, or look, there are trans people who look like your neighbor and want to just work a good job. Like they always have to go through a kind of a moralizing, cleansing story to create a mainstream figure who is supposedly who people can have sympathy for. Like that is what mainstreaming is. It's the deployment of like deserving figures, and it's mainstreaming is this process in which you take a group seeking liberation and you kind of evacuate the politics of their liberation struggle and take this this idea of this deserving figure and use it to restore mainstream institutions. So you use it to, so like, right, the US military constantly is in this battle about its legitimacy because it's like, the largest source of violence in the world, the largest polluter in the world. It's people inside the military are constantly exposing the sexual violence, the exploitation, the racism, the drug war inside the military. It's got legitimacy problems because it is illegitimate, right? And most people in the world know that. And so it needs to do legitimacy and PR work all the time. And one of the ways the US military has always done that is by being like, oh no, look, this is a site of opportunity for hated and marginalized people in the US. Like, look, this is a good job. It's not a good job. This is a way to go to college. It's actually not a good way to go to college, but like, it doesn't matter. You just say it and say it and say it. And so I think that it's not surprising that that whole history of letting people of color serve, or of integrating the ranks, or letting queer people serve, or letting women serve in different ways. All of those are stories about legitimizing that institution. And so you've got a mainstream media that is controlled by the same people who want to sell more arms, who want to have more ways to extract from the earth and from workers. They love militarism, right? So the media loves pro-military and pro-imperialist stories. And then you've got a funding system for nonprofits where rich people decide which nonprofits get money to do what kinds of advocacy. So it's, like rich, like if you're like a rich person, you want to fund advocacy, you want things that like, maintain your worldview and maintain your wealth. So you like militarism sounds pretty good and the cops sound good. You don't want to fund like people who are like, let's get rid of the border and the police and the military. You want to fund like people who are like, let's get gay people into the military. I think the most extreme example of this, of course, is I think the largest grant given ever to trans advocacy at the time was, maybe it was around 2013 or 14. Jennifer Pritzker is part of the Pritzker family, one of the wealthiest families in the United States with, their own dirty money. She's a person who like loves the military. She has a military, like a foundation that just funds like celebrating military history stuff, came out as trans. And she gave this huge grant to the Palm Center, which had already been doing advocacy for gay and lesbian military inclusion, to do advocacy for trans military inclusion. So like when you look at like that kind of money being poured into advocacy for trans military inclusion, and then you see like how this looks like on the media landscape, like it's not proportional to like how many people in trans communities are like, this is what I need most to survive tomorrow, which of course everybody would say like housing, income, instead it's what got funded. And that is, I think, a real big struggle in general with like our movements. They are like distorted through philanthropy, right? Through rich people's control and resourcing. And they're distorted through media coverage that is deeply interested in only telling certain kinds of stories about our communities, stories that are affirming to like status quo institutions that actually are at odds with our community's well-being.
So can you take us through, I know we could talk forever about it, but what are some of those needs of the actual needs of the queer and trans community that are being overlooked because of this mainstreaming?
Yeah. I mean, you wouldn't know it, right? The way that queer and trans people are represented on TV now, because like now we're like being represented in a good way, right? Like that's like supposed to be a victory. But of course, that visibility is very conditional. It's like good means representations of upper and middle class, disproportionately white, not disabled, right, queer and trans people. Like that's we're supposed to be happy when we're represented as like good, but actually what that means is cutting out and hiding the actual struggles of our communities and who we are and what we're, and making it look like we benefit from certain institutions that actually we don't benefit from. So in reality, queer and trans people are disproportionately very poor because we experience like family rejection, tons and tons of employment discriminations, being pushed out of schools, like being in foster care, all these things that produce likelihood of poverty. I mean, the stats about trans poverty, like it is so severe. Like the amount of trans people living, on less than $10,000 a year is wild. I don't have the stats in front of me. I apologize for not bringing them. But the kind of poverty that most trans people live in, and then the like generalized, context of poverty, right? So like if you are a poor person in the United States, you're at the behest, or you live under the control of social services and criminalizing structures that are all gender segregated, right? Like homeless shelters are gender segregated in almost every place that I know of in the US. Prisons and jails are gender segregated. Foster care group homes are gender segregated. Psychiatric wards are gender segregated. And so for trans people, that means like, extra danger or exclusion. Like it's really hard to go into the shelter system at all, which you have to go into to qualify for other forms of housing in most places, because you're like a trans woman who's going to be put into a giant men's shelter, or you're going to be subjected to a lot of like surveillance and control to try to access shelter at all. So that they're kind of, there's multiple levels. Like anybody poor and especially unhoused in the United States has really, really like limited, terrible options. Shelters are essentially jails. And are terrible, dangerous places, and do not actually provide something that I would consider like legitimate shelter. But you can't even access like those kinds of spaces for most trans people living in most cities. So yeah, people are, I think, the things people need are the things that like are just the general needs. Like, I mean, housing is, there's like such a severe housing crisis in the United States. You can see it in every city. Housing is so incredibly expensive. I think, people having crises around public transit, around access to, we live in a for-profit healthcare system that is brutal, that has produced the amount of death we've seen under COVID. People have those same basic needs. And if we look at the last 50 years in the United States, all of those needs have worsened, right? We've seen a growing wealth divide generally, and that wealth divide is gendered and raced, and it's not evenly applied. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and all the things, the conditions that produce poverty, like the increased, higher rents, the informalization of labor, less people being in unions, more people working as temps, less funding for basic necessities in cities, and more tax write-offs for big corporations to try to draw them to cities, worsening conditions of water and air quality. All of those things are affecting queer and trans people in an even sharper way, because we're even more vulnerable because of the additional threads of homophobia and transphobia that shape the basic systems that people get their lives through. So I think it's like a different way to think about queer and trans politics is not to be like, find a place where the law excludes us and be like, if we could just get in there, then everything would be okay. But instead to be like, well, what are the conditions queer and trans people are facing? They're actually conditions a lot of people are facing. If we changed those things, they would, so that like we can understand housing justice as a fundamentally queer and trans issue, or Medicare for all as a fundamentally queer or trans issue, or access to universal childcare, right? That those I think it's a different framing than the one that kind of has been the mainstream gay and lesbian thing, which is like, let's figure out where trans and queer people are excluded from big institutions and get us in there. Let's have a trans cop in our city. It's like, that does not deliver liberation. And obviously I should say very clearly, queer and trans people are very disproportionately criminalized and living in prisons and jails and psychiatric institutions and immigration detention centers all over the country, and facing extremely dire conditions and dying of them. And that, probably my number one priority, if I were to think about what our needs are, would be how to support people, both to stop people from being criminalized, to get people out, and to support people coming out, to stay out, since the people are so frequently recaptured.
So like so many well-meaning people, and rightfully so, kind of have this gut reaction to hearing that inclusion is not necessarily progress. There's so many of reasons for like why people join the military, which are, as you're saying, like largely class-based. And so how do you hold the reality that the military is seemingly the only visible or viable option to access these social programs, while also knowing the reality of what is the military, and also trying to support queer and trans folks who end up joining the military? How do you hold both of those?
Yeah. I don't feel like that's necessarily a contradiction. Like, of course, we're going to support queer and trans people wherever they are, whatever institution they're fighting. And I guess my take is like being in the military and being in prison are really actually similar. Like, there's a lot of like, you're in like incredibly hierarchical, very like inherently abusive and exploitative, violent space run on like sexual violence. And I mean, there's just so many things that are very similar about all spaces of kind of confinement. So yeah, to me, it makes sense that we would, of course, want to support people currently in the US military who are facing all the brutality that happens inside there, help people get out, help people not go in. I think that idea, before we started this event, Charlie and I were talking about somebody I know who, is a young person recently out of prison and thinking about joining the military, and just like, having a really hard time having housing. There's all these ways in which the shelter system and the foster care system are preventing them from living in the housing that people in our community are helping find for them. And just the outrageous ridiculousness of those systems. And like, that person feeling like there's no other option, but also part of what's happening there is that person isn't getting good information about what happens to you in the military, right? Like, so many people I've talked to who are just like, yeah, I did go to the military because I thought it would be my one chance to get access to a college education. And these are all the reasons that was a lie and didn't work out. And these are all the reasons it's so easy to be dishonorably discharged. These are all the reasons in which it's so easy to, like, recruiters can lie to you about, as you described in the opening, right? Like, I think that, and that doesn't speak to all the things that can happen to you there that are so immensely dangerous and change your life forever or end your life, So I think that there's this really painful thing. And I think I see it sometimes, like when I'm working closely in communities of people, which there are many whose communities are targeted for military recruitment. People also have a trauma thing where it's like, we have to believe the military is good because some people in my family did go, and I have to defend that because it's so actually traumatic to acknowledge what was hard and awful about it, or how people came back, or how it changed violence in our family, or how we lost somebody, and what would it be like to acknowledge that we lost them for no reason except for empire's desire to chew us up? Like, just all the ways in which people kind of are forced to narrate the military as having been a good experience. And I see the same thing. Actually, people in prison are often forced to narrate it, that it was good for me. Like, it's just like there's all this social pressure and trying to make sense of trauma that can lead to that. So yeah, I guess like what I'll say is, yes, we want to live in a world in which nobody has to join a military to have a job or go to school or have healthcare, or have housing. That is outrageous. That should not be the conditions under which people get what they need. I personally believe, given the conditions we are living under right now, the way to achieve that, like what queer and trans people need to be doing, is providing that for ourselves and each other in our communities. Like, I feel like really frustrated right now because there are all these anti-trans bills, and I feel like people are doing a lot of hand wringing, like looking at those states and being like, oh no, it's so bad, what's going to happen? And I'm just like, what are we doing in our town for people aging out of foster care right now? Because like, we could worry all day long about whether these good laws or bad laws will pass in different states for trans youth, but there's kind of not much most of us can do about that. Like, it's like, I'm just watching the news. But what we can do is like, be like, what happens to queer and trans people when they get out of prison in my region? Do we have a group of people ready to try to receive them? Do we have an Excel spreadsheet about like, okay, I have a basement room people can live in for a month. Oh, you've got one for 2 weeks. I mean, like, it's that. It's like, yeah, our cities, our states are not going to provide the things that our people need. They never have. They weren't set up to do that. These structures were set up to enrich the rich and to keep the weapons manufacturers going and the oil extractors going and the frackers. Like they're not made for our survival. And we can actually organize to help each other survive. And that's part of building social movements that are strong and have teeth and take bold action to fight back against the ever expanding military and prison and immigration enforcement systems. And so I feel like I think it can be really overwhelming to think about the US military as our opponent in a political struggle, because obviously they've got a lot of money and guns and people, but actually like the work for queer and trans people is just to like support each other's survival right now in our communities. That itself can prevent people from going to the military. That can build our preparedness for like the next and the next and the next moment where we have to rise up, both because of like new wars and also because of like the next, disasters that are coming to our community because of climate change, all the ways in which we need to be organizing to respond. And it feels like we're redirected to just instead be kind of like passive viewers of like a controversy happening somewhere else with like elites, like between like political officials or legislatures. So I guess like that's a lot of how I'm feeling now, is like it's completely in our grasp to support our own community members, whatever horrible institution they are currently being devoured by, and prepare to support them when they get out, including like all the unhoused vets living in the towns that we all live. I mean, just the needs are high in our communities, and there's a kind of, I think, disconnect or disempowerment that I see, where it feels like we're more like passive observers rather than like organizing to just like do mutual aid work with each other right now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I hear a heavy dose of reality and also a lot of hope in what you're saying. Okay, I was hoping you could maybe explain, maybe some folks have heard this term and maybe don't have a grasp of it, but can you explain, and you alluded to it already a bit without using the term, like pinkwashing, what that is within the military industrial complex? What are the pitfalls? Like, how is this all being framed and what are the pitfalls of it?
Yeah, I just asked Natasha to put this link to this movie, Pinkwashing Exposed, that we made in the chat for the folks who are in, I think, the different platforms people are watching this on. Yeah, I think the term pinkwashing actually, comes from Palestinian queer and trans activists talking about the specific ways that the state of Israel has like tried to brand itself as like a gay-friendly country that's like both a good like gay tourist destination and like a progressive place because queer and trans people can serve in their military. So like this has been like basically like 15 years ago or so, the state of Israel like went through a whole process where they intentionally like hired public relations companies to like help them rebrand, because they were like people of the world think of us as like this, they associate us with this like military occupation, and they think of us as like this colonizer of Palestinian people, because that is what the state of Israel is. And so we want to like change our brand. And so the rebranding was like lots of things. Like Israel rebranded itself as like diverse and as like technologically savvy and as like green, and they all, like, for example, they rebranded their military in part by saying like you can be a vegan in their military, you can like serve and have like vegan meals and like have like non-leather and non-wool uniform, like just trying to take this thing, a military, and associate it with this thing, veganism, which is like right, like liberatory framework, and then like right. So they did the same thing with queer and trans people. Like they have this one like top officer who's like trans, and like his full-time job was to like tour like the US and Europe and stuff, being like, look, trans people are top officers in the Israeli military. So this term pinkwashing is like this term to say like, like we're going to scrub the external image of our evil institutions by putting a rainbow flag around them, basically. And this is a strategy used very broadly beyond the state of Israel. Corporations do it when they, their oil company sends a contingent to Pride. Politicians do it when they're like, I love gay marriage. Meanwhile, they're like, doing everything they can to kill all the poor people in their city. Like that. It's a move that's really common. I think we can just see it more generally as like, think about like propaganda. Like I think, and like sometimes it's tokenization. All these things are part of it. Like, we've seen with all of the uprisings against anti-Black police violence, you see one of the key moves that a city will do is they'll suddenly have a Black spokesperson for the police. Like these are propaganda moves. They're moves that are about trying to legitimize illegitimate institutions that are whose violence is being named effectively by movements. I think it's really hard for a lot of people to see propaganda in the U.S. Like we're not very well trained to be discerning about propaganda. So it's been really helpful to have Palestinians name this term pinkwashing and to have lots of us be able to use it in lots of contexts, because what happens is people are like, wow, the U.S. military lets gay people in or lets trans people in, and they take the feelings they have about us as a hated group who are in a freedom struggle, and those feelings get borrowed and move over to the military itself. Or this happens when they hire a trans cop in your town, or when the cop cars have rainbow flags on them. Have you guys seen this in New York and other places? This move of we're going to borrow the feelings of this group seeking freedom, and we're going to tape them to this institution that is in every way anti-freedom. And that is we all need to have, to cultivate a kind of queer and trans discernment about that. And I think also it's kind of targeted at straight people, because straight people are really likely to be dupes about that because they don't want to be homophobic or transphobic. And then they're I just think they're I think this really happened heavily with marriage, right? Feminists forever had been marriage, it's a terrible system that makes some people's lives supported and other people's lives, abandoned. It's a terrible way to distribute thousands of kinds of benefits and rights based on how you organize your sexual and family life. This is a horrible idea. It's based in the idea that women are property of men, etc. But when gay marriage advocacy emerged, it was you're homophobic if you're not for gay marriage. And so suddenly it was as if that was a liberatory site, as opposed to, just the same move of including a few hated people in a really, 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 really bad system and institution. So having the ability to see what pinkwashing is helps us. You even see this with the election of Lori Lightfoot in Chicago. They love to put a gay politician in front of us. They love to put the rainbow flag on the cop car. Just how can we all move to a place where we make no mistakes about what that is, and we really get that adding some queer and trans people or changing a supposed service policy about queer and trans people in something like the military does not mean the military changes what it is. And I think that's why it's been so important during the same period where there's been such a live debate in recent years that you were describing, Shiloh, about trans military service. There's been so much expose of sexual assault in the military. And just the wild, ridiculous, outrageous, then they appoint someone to fix it, and then that person turns out is someone who does it, just nonstop, right? I think that's been really useful for us to just remember, well, what is this job that we're supposed to want? What actually happens to people who get that job? What is that place? Just having people come back to material reality from this really messed up symbolic realm of pinkwashing, where they just borrow the feelings of queer and trans liberation, which are beautiful feelings that, are about thousands of years of struggle, and then just put it on top of the very things that are actually the enemies of our freedom,
Lipstick on a pig.
Exactly. I love that.
So yeah, I wanted to ask you, it's been over 10 years since Obama repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And in a recent published Journal of Traumatic Stress, they found that over 80% of LGBTQ plus military members reported experiencing military sexual trauma. What do you think policy reform? Why do you think policy reform shows minimal change within the military?
Yeah, I think policy reform shows minimal change in so many realms. I'm going to give another link to Natasha, if you're willing to put that in the chat, Natasha. That's I think a useful kind of deeper take on this if people want to read more. It was a debate that I had with Aaron Belkin, who's the head of the Palm Center, about these questions. But yeah, I think for me, it's really useful to think about the history of, anti-Black racism in the U.S., in which we see the U.S., is founded on and through anti-Black racism, through chattel slavery. And we see again and again that the policies of it change. So we go from slavery to black codes to like Jim Crow, like apartheid, like explicit apartheid to now then explicit apartheid in the US becomes illegal, sometime in the 50s and 60s. And then now we live in de facto apartheid. We still have schools are more segregated than they were during the time of Brown versus Board of Education. Housing is segregated. Poverty is concentrated among Black people. Black people are, live in the most polluted communities, all right, like anti-Black conditions, material conditions of anti-Black racism alive and well. Plus we have like the addition of this, huge expansion of the criminal punishment system, which is targeted at Black people. Like the material conditions of anti-Black racism very much ongoing, in some ways sharpening and worsening over time as things like the criminal system expand. So we have to just ask, like when policies supposedly change, like what's really going on under there? And we're encouraged not to. We're supposed to be like, oh, the law corrects itself, and it corrected itself. And that's just a story about how like US laws are good, or the Constitution is fundamentally right, or the legal system is fundamentally just, none of which is true, right? It's a colonial system founded in racism. It is designed for capitalist extraction. Like that's what it does. And so, yes, it corrects itself for legitimacy, but it keeps its business going. Like its fundamental business is still going. So yes, it's like if militarism, militarism is always, gender-based violence is central to militarism. Always. Anywhere where there are militaries, there is sexual violence happening. Like it is part of war, as part of militarism. And that's going to have certain kinds of impacts on queer and trans people as specific targets of sexual violence, right? And so there's no doubt that you could change anything. You can make the military uniforms rainbow, and you would still have the same violence targeted at queer and trans people and women inside the military. And I think that and it's racialized. I mean, there's so much evidence about who is dishonorably dismissed from the military, and how like Black women who complain about sexual violence are dismissed. I mean, all of these pieces, right? And so I think there's this kind of like, we have to look past what the system says about itself and ask, like, what is happening to the people there? And I think we all already know that. It's actually common sense on some level, because we all already live in systems where we're like, oh yeah, there's all these rules about stuff and nobody follows them, or they don't change what happens. Like you can live in a state like I do, where discrimination against trans people is illegal, but like trans people can't get into drug treatment. You know what I mean? Because the drug treatment places are just like, we don't know where to put you, even if it's like state mandate. So they have to spend more time in prison because they can't get to the drug treatment alternative program, or where we know the trans people, like, we all live in states and a country where supposedly like housing discrimination is illegal, but we know for a fact that it's easier for white people to get housing than anybody else. And that there's no way that that's ever been enforced. And that like, as wealth continues to consolidate and the racial wealth divide continues to grow, that means the housing crisis is worse for people of color. And it doesn't matter, for 50 years, there's been fair housing laws in the books. Like, I just think there's just like this piece around, like, it's another kind of discernment, just like, yeah, the like legal change rarely produces the change people hope it will. And I think an example of this that's really meaningful in our community is the National Prison Rape Elimination Act, which maybe is it like 15 years old now? I've said somewhere around there. And it's like that sounds good, right? Like we would all love to have laws that could stop the severity of sexual violence inside prisons, which of course specifically queer and trans communities experience, very targeted in our lives. But what happened when they passed that was that it was used in lots of different states and lots of different prison systems to further punish queer and trans prisoners for expressing queer and transness, for having any kind of consensual affectionate contact of any kind. And like in some prison systems, they literally wrote up new regs that were like, that allowed them to punish people who were gender nonconforming in the prison, like if they grew their nails or went by a different name or hair or whatever. And then they also, like, if you complain about sexual violence and it's not, and your complaint isn't believed, which is very typical in prisons, then you'll be punished for having had consensual sex. So actually what queer and trans prisoners said immediately was, this law, PREA, is being used to worsen conditions of targeting inside US prisons. I just think so part of it is, if we ever want to, we have to not believe when they tell us our issues have been resolved by a law. We have to not believe that. And we have to wonder whether putting all of our energy into trying to resolve them in a law really works, because it keeps not working. And then we have to be like, who on the ground inside that system, the prisoners, the soldiers, who on the ground can tell us what's really happening in there with this supposed change, right? And just not accept the kind of surface story that the system wants to tell, that it resolved our problem.
So what do you think I want to ask you, like, what brings you inspiration or hope within defeating the military-industrial complex? Or what movements bring you hope? I want to kind of maybe bring some levity or a little bit of hope into the conversation.
Absolutely. I'm giving this link to Natasha, this queer trans warband link. One thing that's been really fun to do in the last few years is like we've been creating materials like stickers and posters and stuff. I see one of them behind you on the wall that are, aimed at anti-military recruitment in queer and trans spaces. So people like printing all this stuff and going to Pride or going to other queer and trans events and like trying to open up a conversation about like anti-war politics in queer and trans communities, and like also like anti-military recruitment fact sheets and stuff. So those are all on that website, and for anyone to like print out and do in their own communities. And feel free to contact me if you want help on figuring out like anything about how to print stickers and stuff. So that's been really fun. Like, just can we build community very locally in all of our own towns and counties and cities about like what it means to be anti-war as a queer and trans politics. I also am involved with this group Dissenters, which I am really excited about, that has chapters on lots and lots of campuses around the country, and is a group that is really like, it's focused on delegitimizing war and U.S. military imperialism, building an anti-war movement that's especially centered in like anti-racism, which I think there's been like a long history of like a lot of kind of white anti-war work in the U.S. that has missed the boat on some parts of the analysis, and it's played out in some parts of the politics. And it's this group where people are like also from like deeply in abolitionist work and, deeply in work around migrant justice, like really like thinking about U.S. military imperialism from the perspective of people of color in the U.S., indigenous people in the U.S., people displaced by wars all around the world, people who are economic refugees of U.S. Policies. And I like just love working in that group, and especially getting to know young people, many of whom are directly impacted by U.S. military imperialism, who are trying to build an anti-war movement, doing deep campus work, and connecting the work on campus to the work off campus. And I feel that is relieving to me to just like get to be part of that, to know that is happening, to get to do anything to support that makes me feel really excited. And I think, more broadly, I think this question of hope is a really complex one at this time, because what we don't want is we don't want people to have the kind of thin hope that the US loves, where it's like, everything's just going to be all right. Or there's one person I like in Congress, so that makes me feel good. Or like, I've read an article about renewable energy, so now I feel better. It's like, no, shit is bleak. Like, things are really, really, really dire. It's a vital time for us all to mobilize. There is not really an option of just being sad about it. We actually have to like sort out how we're going to work together to survive like the kind of coming and present disasters, that the ones we've been living with, like living in a healthcare for profit system, living in a system, where half of all our cities and states' money goes to policing and prisons, where, the U.S. budget is all about the military, like living under those crises, and the crises that are coming with each fire season, with each storm season, with each set of budget cuts, with each new war. Like, we have so much to be worried about. And we actually have a lot of wisdom in our communities that what actually makes us safer is people doing direct work on the ground with each other and with their neighbors, like people doing disaster prep, people doing mutual aid projects about the crises that are happening now, supporting people who are in prisons in our region, supporting people coming out of foster care and prison and youth jails, and fighting for people who are in the immigration detention centers closest to us, and doing childcare projects with our neighbors, and doing court support for people who are being put through various systems, and doing needle exchange, and just like doing the work to build our ability to survive together, to learn how to make decisions together, to learn how to work together in groups, to learn who our neighbors are, so that when the next storm comes, we know who's on upper floors of a building and can't get down if the lights are out. Like, all of that kind of very basic work that is mutual aid work, that is community organizing work, that is thinking about our local targets. Oh, we want to stop this fracking project. We want to block this, coal train. We want to stop this pipeline. Like, just actually, like, that is the answer. For me, I think that is like the practice of hope, is like actually trying to build the social relations we want to live in, trying to know each other, trying to skill up, for what we need for the coming disasters and for supporting people who are, living the worst conditions of the current disasters, and preparing for bolder and bolder action to take apart the systems that are still killing us. Like climate change is still getting worse. Like the military is still we're not even slightly winning yet. Most police budgets are still going up in almost every city, despite this incredible uprising. The main thing I'm focused on is just mobilizing more people to take more immediate and direct action in their lives instead of kind of watching the show and waiting for politicians to do it. And I think a lot of people have been mobilized during the pandemic and during the uprising. And so I feel hopeful about that, and also aware that it's we need to do a lot of very material work to mobilize so many more tens of millions of people to have any significant wins, because the only thing we have on our side is that most people in the world are losing out from these systems. We don't have the money, we don't have the guns. Our opponents have all of that. What we have is just numbers of people, but only if we're mobilized and organized. And so that is, I think that's where all the hope is in practicing that. And I don't know if it's going to work or what's going to happen in my lifetime, or if we're going to, how it's going to play out. But I'd also just rather live my remaining days in scrappy groups of people, fighting for what we care about. It's such a beautiful way to know people. It means that I have people in my life who have my back. It means I have deep connections because we're doing hard stuff together. It's a better life for me. And that also, I think, is I think people are oh, doing organizing, that sounds hard. It's what's hard is living in isolation and only going to your extractive job. What feels good is actually being connected to other people who care about what you care about, and feeling that that mutual support. That's the only way to live under these incredibly bleak conditions. So I hope that's a pitch for why it's worth doing that.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Dean. And if anyone is looking for a primer, or how do I even start that? Your latest book is, a beautiful read. You're saying, it's not a thin hope, it's a hope with action. Hope always has action. We work a lot with the dissenters, and that, if you're looking for hope, just turn towards a young person.
I'm curious. I know we have to go, but I'm curious what you say to people who are thinking about joining the military.
This is a really good question, and something that I think about a lot. I coach a queer trans youth soccer team, age 13 to 16. Shout out to the Fancy Frogs. And this question kind of comes up sometimes, in just talking. And the first thing I would tell them is, just whatever recruiters are telling you is a lie. That's the first main thing. Just like cops, they're under no obligation to tell you the truth. The second is just, someone told me once in the military, I remember I was in Quantico, Virginia, in sergeant's course, and one of the instructors I was talking to said, people join the Marines because they're running to something or from something. And that struck me as finally hit why I joined the Marine Corps. And so if it's community that you're trying to find, there is a beautiful, vibrant, colorful, welcoming queer and trans community, and it's not in the military. You head to a big city if you can, anything like that. And then the other thing is, if they do decide, that this is what they need to do, they need to join the military, I would definitely tell them, take advantage of the healthcare that's provided in while you're on active duty. Get your, if you're seeking a gender affirming surgery, get it, because the VA doesn't cover that. So do that while you're on active duty, and keep leaning into your queer and trans communities that are outside of the military. Yeah, it is a tough question though, because of the water that we're swimming in. That seems like the viable option for a lot of people.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Thank you for asking, Dee. And we are coming up on time. I would talk to you forever, and I really enjoyed this conversation, and hope that we can continue to do some work together and continue the conversation.
Very grateful for your work. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Dean. Let's see, for everyone, thank you everyone for being here. This conversation on queer and trans inclusion in the military. I hope that maybe you learned something. I hope maybe you felt validated in some feelings that you're having that are often unpopular opinions. And also, I hope that if you felt uncomfortable, that you lean into that discomfort and keep being curious about it. Dean, I'm so grateful for who you are in the world, for being here in the world, Big Sense, and for being here with us today. As I've said to you, like, you've just continued to be a beacon of light for me in some personal storms, and yeah, you're just a light of queer trans brilliance, and I'm just so grateful. So that, unless you have anything to add, Dean, that will conclude this edition of About Face DemilitarizeU. And yeah, thank you so much, and be well.